This is Corey Anderson standing in for Natalie Jolly, normally our host today, who wasn't able to join us. And so, by way of introduction, we would like to welcome you to today's Apasa Cafe, our nearly monthly colloquium featuring cutting edge Anabaptist scholarship. Thank you for joining us today for the presentation with John Eicher, who will be sharing more with us in a moment in a talk entitled German and Mennonite Mythologies and the Transnational Age. And I will eventually turn the time over to Martin to introduce John more fully. Before we do that, though, I'd like to start out by thanking Andrea Waxmonski, an integral member of our Apasa Scholarship Committee, because she is the one who is managing all the technology to make this event possible, and we are very grateful for her ongoing contribution. For those of you joining us for the first time, please save your questions for the end of the presentation or put them in the chat. Our presenter is going to be speaking for about half an hour, and that should allow us plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. If you do participate in the conversation after the presentation, your questions and comments will be recorded, and those recordings will be available to our members on our website. For the portion that's just the talk, that's available to anyone, but the discussion portion is available just to our members. So there's a limited amount of distribution there. You can check that out as well as all of our previous Apasa Cafes on our website, amishstudies.org, which is turning into quite a collection of recordings. If you are joining us on the telephone and would like to ask a question in our Q&A portion, you could unmute by pushing *6. Before we go further, just several announcements. We do have a new issue of Jopis that's been available for about a month. Print copies are being mailed out within a couple days, but our online version is available. If you go to our amishstudies.org website, you can navigate to the journal. This was a special issue co-edited by Rosanna Hess and Braxton Mitchell. And the special issue was on health, and they will be speaking at our next cafe. That is on February 23rd. So mark your calendars, and you could even go into our website now and register for that. Also, we have release dates for our Apasa conference this summer, July 16th and 17th. It will again be at the Wilderness Center in Wilmot, Ohio, which is right adjacent to the Holmes County, Ohio Amish settlement. So mark your calendars for that. We are accepting proposals at this point for research presentations, but as usual, we will have a full set of very dynamic panel discussions that are really the centerpiece of our conferences. Without further ado, then, I will turn the time over to Martin Lutz for a formal introduction of John Eicher and to moderate the rest of the cafe today. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks so much, Corey. Thank you very much for joining us, and a warm welcome from Berlin, Germany. As you can see in the back, it's already dark in Central Europe. It's a great pleasure to host and moderate today's Apasa Cafe with a very important figure in recent Mennonite historiography, John Eicher, who is an associate professor of modern European history at Penn State. He received his PhD from University of Iowa with a dissertation that is very important because it feeds into a much larger debate on national identity in modernization contexts or histories of modernization in the 19th and 20th centuries. It was published by Cambridge University Press and received a number of awards, and as one of several books in recent Mennonite historiography that deal with the issue of national identity and religion. Another book, slightly older, by Ben Gosen, Chosen Nation, Mennonites in Germany in a Global Era, and then even a little bit older, Mark Jansen's book on Mennonite German soldiers, which I had the privilege to review a few years ago. So this is very important because religion and national identity can often entail tensions, a conflictual relationship. particularly in an era of nationalism. And this is part of John's research that was supported by a number of institutions, such as the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., with a great postdoctoral program, the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, the German Academic Exchange Service, and the Mennonite Historical Society. The book was published, I think, in 2020, titled, now I need to find the title.
Exiled Among Nations.
Exiled Among Nations, thanks, German and Mennonite Mythologies in a Transnational Age. You're currently working on a timely project, the 1918 influenza pandemic, which is, of course, absolutely relevant for us in the present as well. But this is not going to be the topic for your talk, but you'll go back to the Exiled Among Nations. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about your research and results. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Corey, too, for your intro. What I'll do is I think I'll just go to my screen share right now after that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the book. I'm going to set it up. I'll be talking about sort of the context and the arguments that I make in the book, like what's important about it. And then I'll go through sort of the narrative of the book, because the book is very narrative based. And talk about the movements of Mennonites in the early 20th century. And then I'll end with a slide on takeaways, like what was actually, like what's important about all this. So let me go to screen share here, desktop 2. All right. Can everyone see the title slide? We good?
Excellent.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to spend too much time setting up the Mennonites. I think everyone's familiar with them. The focus of the Mennonites I look at specifically, though, are the Russian group of Mennonites that went from the Netherlands through Danzig, and then subsequently in the late 1700s, early 1800s, settled in what is now sort of Russia, Ukraine. And so that's where the story starts in the 1870s. So the first group shown in white here, the white dots, I'm sorry, the black dots, they are composed of voluntary migrants and left Russia for Canada in the 1870s, and then left Canada for Paraguay in the 1920s. And when they finally arrived in Paraguay, they started what was called the Menno colony, and they numbered about 2,000 individuals. And they were voluntary migrants, and they rejected all outside attachments. That's the important thing about their story for my book. The second group here depicted in white was composed of refugees. And unlike the Menno colony, they wanted to create connections with multiple outside entities once they reached Paraguay. And this group remained in Russia until 1929, when Stalinist persecution forced them to flee to Germany and China, and then eventually to Paraguay. And they also numbered about 2,000 people. And they wanted to create relationships with the Nazi Party. They supported the Paraguayan government during the Chaco War against Bolivia. That was 1932 to 35. And they wanted to also proselytize their faith to indigenous people. And this is sort of the question around which the whole project revolves. For the first 15 years of settlement, the groups had little interest in helping each other or even communicating with each other. And that's really bizarre, because they're in the middle of nowhere. They both need like as much help as they can get, particularly the Fernheimers. And they have a lot in common, but they don't really make use of that relationship. So the question I pose is why or how? How did this happen? Why did these groups with such similar backgrounds stay separated from each other? And what, more broadly, do these movements of these migrants and refugees tell us about governments and the formation of nation states during the era of high nationalism? So nationalism is a major force in the world, 1850, 1950 or so. This is the height of that. And what does it tell us about governments? So the arguments that I put forward are, let's see here. let me get that out of the way. Between 1870 and 1945, Russia's Mennonites and also other religious migrants. So I'm looking at them specifically because you need something to hold on to when you study a phenomenon. But a lot of the observations I make could be made about other religious groups too. Even, there's the Jewish diaspora and so forth. And these Mennonites use the global spread of nationalism and religious ecumenicism, in this case, Christian ecumenicism, this interest in helping each other across vast territories, to aid their movements by assuming and abandoning national and religious identifications. Sort of like, we belong to, we're that nationality. Oh, wait, we're this thing, we're that, they're switching around who they are. And they interpret their movements by appropriating, using, and adapting national and religious myths. So they're interpreting their movements as they go along, and they're not only drawing on religious myths, but also national myths at times, like, the German nation, for instance. At the same time, governments and relief organizations, in this case, the MCC, the Mennonite Central Committee, we're trying to monopolize and homogenize national and religious identifications. During this era of high nationalism, these large groups are trying to make their populations consistent. And they use migrants and refugees for their own purposes by portraying them as enemies or heroes in their national and religious mythologies. So both groups are telling stories, right? Nations, religious organizations, NCC, and then the people they're helping, they're also telling their own stories. And those stories don't really go together, and that causes a lot of tension. And to explain that, we're going to map their movements as they moved around the world. Okay, so, right. I'll now describe my project, demonstrating how Mennonites deployed their national and religious identifications in different contexts. And after that, I will describe my methodology, or the analysis I use to make sense of it. So in the 1870s, by the 1870s, there's about 60,000 Mennonites living in Russia. And that's at the time, there's a Russification campaign started by the Tsar. In particular, they wanted public schooling, Russian language. They were really trying to make all these little groups that were in their borders become Russian. And about 20,000 Mennonites didn't really like that. So they left for North America, Canada and the United States. And when they leave, the Canadians identify them as migrants who will build colonies on the cheap, at least from the government perspective, in the West. They're autonomous. They don't need a lot of help. They're German speakers, which they have this aura of being good settlers. They're Christians. Not only that, they're Protestant Christians, so they're not Catholic like the Quebecois. And they're farmers, so they can make the land productive, and that's great. And this arrangement lasted for about 50 years until Canada not only wanted to nationalize their land, but the people on that land. And the Mennonites do this really good job of saying, we're going to leave society, and then they leave society. And they build a bunch of infrastructure that actually connects society to them, like roads, grain distribution, railheads, stuff like that. So it's kind of ironic. But at that point then, in the early 20s, they come to, loggerheads, and about 2,000 Mennonites leave for Paraguay. And here, and they go to Mexico and other places too. But here, the Paraguayan government identifies them as migrants, of course, farmers who will settle the Chaco, but also as white. It was important that they were white during this era of, I think, high racism. Meanwhile, oh, here you go. Here's a picture of a couple pictures of the Minnow colony. You can see things are pretty rough there with that schoolhouse photo, but after about 10 years or so, things start looking, pretty good for them. So meanwhile, back in Russia, there's now about 100,000 Mennonites living in the country by the time of the First World War. And At the beginning of the war, the Russian government wants to nationalize all German speakers' land, so basically steal it. And the Mennonites say, "Oh, well, we're not German. We have German Bibles and we speak, German, but we're Dutch, And so they drag up old artifacts, Dutch, and the Russians say, "Okay, fine, you can keep your land." But then in 1918, the German army invades their lands, and they say, "Oh, well, we're not Dutch anymore. Now we're German." So they send a delegation to Berlin, and they get recognized by the occupying German forces that they can keep their land. And then the Germans leave, and the Bolsheviks come in, and they don't care what ethnicity they are, right? They care about class, and Mennonites are wealthy farmers, they're kulaks, and are labeled as such. So with that identification, as the persecution of kulaks begins in 1929, about 8 to 10,000 or so leave for Germany. And here in Germany, they're identified as refugees, and specifically a very, valuable and romantic kind of refugee. They're Auslandsdeutsche, which means overseas Germans. So the Germans say, "Oh, look, our brethren abroad, we're going to help them." But they can't stay there because it's the beginning of the Great Depression, and they don't want more, expenses. So across the Atlantic, a group of progressive Mennonite intellectuals in the United States learned of this plight and quickly reform a Mennonite aid organization called MCC. And they were composed of General Conference Mennonites, Old Mennonites, and some progressive Canadian Mennonites. So it's very ecumenical, it's very transnational. And this group really is interested in homogenizing and clarifying what Mennonites are to governments. Right? Mennonites say all kinds of things about who they are because they're all cut up into tiny little groups. MCC wanted to say Mennonites are this and this alone, nonviolence especially, and this could then be easily and homogeneously articulated to world governments. Right? And so within a few weeks of reforming, the MCC decides to help resettle the refugees in Latin America. Though they didn't have any money, logistics, or manpower to do it. And they're also identified as white when they go to Paraguay. So anyway, this group dispatches Goshen College professor Harold S. Bender to Germany, and as he later admitted to his friend Noah Euer, "Now you can imagine the sort of speech I made to the refugees in Berlin, in a language I do not master, on a subject of which I am ill-informed." And the MCC took this gamble of resettling these individuals because it imagined there was this global Mennonite identity, this transnational Mennonite nation, so to speak. And they were compelled to offer mutual support to other Mennonites. And those other Mennonites would, recognize them as speaking on their behalf. Well, so yeah, MCC sends, help and delegations, so forth, to Paraguay all throughout the 30s. This is what the Fernheim colony settlement looks like. And interestingly, the Mennonites want them to go to Paraguay when they're still in Berlin. The Mennonites want these refugees to go to Paraguay because they'd be isolated. They could be like a little Mennonite preserve in the middle of nowhere. But the German government said, you should go to Brazil because there's already German settlers in Brazil, and then they would retain their Germanness if they went to Brazil. So there's kind of a tension there. Also, Brazil was way more safe because the Chaco War is going to break out in like a few months after the Mennonites arrived. So the MCC was not thinking geopolitically, and strategically in like military terms. Anyway, some do go to Brazil, most go to Paraguay. And there you can see they also are able to establish themselves like the Menno colony. Oh yeah, and then some also go to China. Here, they're identified, of course, as refugees. This is Harbin, China. But when they try to go to Canada, the Canadian government identifies them as Chinese immigrants. So no Chinese immigrants are allowed to Canada. So they can't go to Canada, even though they're not Chinese. They're labeled as such. So they also, go to Paraguay too, just like the other groups. So within a few months, as I said, Bolivia and Paraguay declare war on each other. And the Fahrenheit Mennonites are quick to intervene. it will intervene, help the Paraguayan government however they can, supplying food and so forth. They don't fight on their behalf, but they're very helpful. And over the course of this next decade, the 1930s, upwards of 90% of Fahrenheim's colonists at one point drifted in the direction of supporting Nazi Germany. They wanted, by supporting Nazi Germany, to ensure their right maybe to return to Ukraine if Russia was defeated, Soviet Union was defeated, or at least go back to Germany and settle there instead of in the middle of nowhere. But in the meantime, the Fahrenheimers squabbled amongst themselves over whether they owed allegiance to Paraguay, Nazi Germany, or their Mennonitism. They also established a missionary organization called Light to the Indian that attempted to convert the Chaco's indigenous population to Christianity. But of course, as always, the Menno colony wants to have nothing to do with MCC, Nazis, or indigenous people, besides hiring them for seasonal work. And well, as we know, the Nazi regime came to naught, and the MCC stepped up its mission work, and both colonies remain in the Chaco to this day. Here are some artifacts from Harold S. Bender's 1939 visit. You can see a Nazi garden there, picture of Hitler right there too. But by that point, they really had established themselves and built, a fair amount of infrastructure. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Well, the Menno colony Mennonites rode this wave of nationalism to preserve their local autonomy, while the Fahrenheim colony traded on their ethnic, national, and religious identifications to save their lives and gain accommodations from outsiders. So I wanted a way to talk about how both groups understood their movements and identifications. How are they interpreting all this? And I thought the most effective way to do this was to look at the stories they used to interpret their movements and identifications, and how they understood themselves as actors in larger, unfolding religious and national mythologies. And what I discovered is that the voluntary migrants of Menno colony and the refugees of Fahrenheim articulated very different ideas about the trajectories and roles of their communities in the world. And these can be mapped in a way as plot progressions, like a plot in a book. So the Menno colony thought of their movements as a series of comic plot progressions. And a comic plot progression, this, takes the narrative shape of a U. Things are fine, there's a crisis, and then there's a happy ending at the end. Like Shakespeare, like any romantic comedy you see or anything, there's a crisis and then there's a resolution, usually a marriage, right, at the end. And this is playing out this way for the Menno colony. In their writings, the Menno colony drew on biblical stories to interpret these movements, from Israel wandering in the desert for 40 years to Jesus wandering in the wilderness for 40 days. And so all of these movements seemed very natural and even necessary to the Menno colony. There's not a lot of crisis here. And Menno colony also played a role in emerging Russian, Canadian, and Paraguayan nationalist narratives about the trials of integrating land and people into the national fabric, which would eventually result in a happy conclusion of nationalized land and nationalized populations. The Menno colony aligned with these narratives for a while, but eventually departed from them, as we saw. Alternately, the Fahrenheim colony understood themselves as trapped inside a tragic plot progression, and this takes the shape of an inverted U. These Mennonites truly believed Russia was their biblical promised land, and their settlement in Russia kind of represented an end of their history of migration. Leaving, again, was not on their mental map. But when they fled to Germany, they were forced to reconsider this notion. So they go to Germany, right? And there's this ambiguity. Maybe Germany is where we're supposed to end up. So they're kind of neutral. They're distraught they have to leave, but hey, Germany's okay. Maybe we're supposed to come back to Germany. Maybe that was God's plan. But then they're sent to Paraguay. And this is where it takes that tragic turn, right? It goes down. And this place isn't on their mental map. And so they have to be inventive about interpreting this story. So some Fahrenheimers believe Paraguay was just a test from God and they would eventually return, right? The U would go back up to Russia or Germany. And at the same time, the Nazis also fit the Mennonites into their narrative of a national tragedy because the refugees were evidence that Germans at home and abroad were suffering from Germany's losses after World War II. So they really go together well with with the Nazi narrative. Anyway, the idea that the Fahrenheim refugees could return to Germany also merged with the Nazi narrative of Germany's myth of the East, too. So that holds that Germany is supposed to dominate Eastern Europe. So the Mennonites are fitting in a lot of ways here. These Mennonites, oh, they're going to go back and repopulate Russia after, we kill everyone. But others in the Fahrenheim colony believed that God had called them to, wait, where's my, okay, Russia. Oh yeah, like I could just explain, had called them to Paraguay to proselytize to indigenous people and help maybe the Paraguayan government in the Chaco War, right? And still others thought, well, maybe God has abandoned us and we should abandon this whole project. And they end up going to Ascension or even Canada and Brazil. So there's a lot of dissonance in this narrative that Fahrenheim colony is telling. They're not as unified as the Minnow colony. And it's obvious, the MCC, for its part, conceived of itself as part of an entirely new story, a story of transnational Mennonite solidarity. And they believed the Anabaptists were lulled to sleep as Mennonites. They had become the quiet in the land. And now it was time to rejuvenate that Anabaptist vision, as Bender called it, and go out into the world on a global scale and unite all these Mennonites once again. It's very grandiose. So the MCC therefore saw their narratives as a fresh start for Mennonites, one that would lead to a modern unified future. And this is really a quintessential story of progress, isn't it? There we go. So there's this awakening, right? And now there's going to be this unity. So, of course, these three different narratives are going to lead to a lot of dissonance. And so that's why, that's my explanation for why they're not getting along. But even though these groups were like three metronomes, sort of each moving at a different speed, they eventually came into line after World War II when a new group of refugees, composed mostly of women, I think, which really helped things, arrived in the Chaco. And they all could make a story or incorporate a story of helping these people. MCC, Menno, and Fahrenheim together. And it's after that you really see relationships start to thaw. So the takeaways here are that in the past decade or two, there have been a lot of historians and social scientists who've started to treat the phenomenon of nationality and nationalism more as an event rather than as a permanent, unchanging condition. And what I mean by that is that nations and other groups have moments of groupness. Rogers Brubaker calls this term moments of groupness, specific times when populations experience a collective national, ethnic, or religious solidarity. It's not constant, it just happens once in a while, like 9/11 in the US. And this concept's really interesting, but it leaves the question open as to how these moments fit together. You can have moments of groupness, but how do they fit? And my work shows they fit when people are unified as a group and they connect plot points in their stories together across time. So there's a story being told, and then there are these moments of groupness within that story. My second intervention concerns the historiography or the writing on German immigration in German communities living abroad. Most books on German speakers abroad treat them as a block of Germans, like all the German speakers who happen to live outside Germany. But these German speakers hold many different identifications, religious, culture, class, linguistics, country of origin. In other words, Germanists is a part of local communities, right? But they're not necessarily part of Germany, right? After all, there have been 6 different German governments from 1871 to the present, each with its own idea of what German is. I therefore argue that even when diasporic communities do align with the Germanness articulated by the German government, it's mostly done for their own reasons and not for the betterment of Germany. My third intervention concerns literature on refugees. By and large, a lot of this language about refugees in the modern era is framed by the UN, the Commission on High Refugees, and it's very policy-oriented, it's very presentist, and it treats migrants and refugees as a problem that needs a solution. But in a modern nation-state world where literally every piece of land in the world is owned by a nation-state, refugees are a permanent condition. This is not going away, right? So they're right. It also what was I going to say? I was going to say, oh yeah, right. The other thing, and this is sort of the final point here. Governments and aid organizations will always misunderstand refugees in a way because here in this story, Mennonite colonies, because they have an abstract idea of them. And this is a fundamental problem in our modern world. Graphics, graphs, charts, citizenship applications, all of these things turn real people into numbers, into abstractions. And when people become numbers, we stop seeing their reality and even their humanity. And they become an asset or a liability. And I think helping people on a large scale is possible in the world, but we may never actually understand what we're doing or exactly who we're helping, right? Like the MCC never really understood the Fahrenheimers. They were just trying to use them to create their own mythology of this unified Mennonitism. So at the broadest level, my research uses two small groups of Mennonites to show how a lot of mobile populations responded to the twin developments of nationalism and religious ecumenicism during the modern era. And I thank you for listening to my presentation.